Hey, all right. Hey, hey, hey now. Hey, family, how y'all doing? Yeah, this is late for me. This is late for me, but it's all good. Hey, Copper Engine, Copper Aborigines, Rodney. Hey, Mookie. Hey, Rodney, Damon, David, observing the facts. Everybody watching, appreciate it. I think this segment will be pretty interesting because let me turn the music off. Is my mic? Does my mic sound okay? My mic check. Hey, hey, hey. So, hey. So, oh, good. Thank you, Damon. So, here's the thing. I'm having a hard time. This is why I love research because you can't let everybody tell you about history. And the only way I find comfort is if I go in and analyze things myself to make sense. And remember, when we're doing research, we're gathering information from scholars and everybody that writes, and you try to put everybody has such different perspectives and things of that nature, but I strive to reach for what makes sense and what don't at this point, because personally I don't know what happened 5,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. None of us do. We can only go based on, hey, underground, we can only go based on the information that's here and what makes sense. Like when somebody says my ancestors been here for 60,000 years. Okay, all right. I'm glad you have that count, but oh, thank you, underground. I'm glad you have that count and that confidence, and there's nothing wrong with that. There really is. But when I read a lot of things and I listen to a lot of research about history and as it pertains to our people, I question a lot of stuff because I don't believe everything that's told to me. Um, hey Kai. And I said, okay, it's so confusing because one minute, I think, well, maybe this was originally Europe, or I think of so many things going on in my head because there's so much information out there and there's so much that don't make no sense. Like, for instance, I sometimes like, what? Are we in Europe? And they're just lying, saying that that's Europe over there. Is this really New England, or is that old England, or is this old England? Is that new? You don't know because we're going based on things that people tell us. Like, wait a minute. Uh, I don't know. Like, Europeans, what I do know, Europeans have been on this soil for a very long time. That's one thing I do know, and that's a fact. It was always us and them. That is a fact. That's one fact that nobody on this planet cannot take away. We have been working and living amongst Europeans for thousands of years. Okay, because if they came here in 1492 and it's like they got like this exact year, I don't know. I I don't know. Sometimes I have. That's why I said learning and history. Learning about history is infinite to me. I don't stop anywhere. So I have to feel comfortable. And the only way I'm feeling comfortable is when I'm finding out, when I'm going out there looking for myself. Granted, I'm a person who just love um presentations. That's just me. I can sit and watch someone's lecture on presentations all day, as long as it's interesting. And I love doing presentations myself. I was always doing that when I was in undergrad and grad school because it's something I love. I love talking about interesting historical topics. So that's my hobby, really. I do. So what I want to do, I want to make things make sense because to me, I'm like, well, wait a minute, maybe I don't know. It's like people always say, well, what was your language you speaking? What if this is the language? I'm serious, the original language. I mean, people steal everything, damn thing else from you. So why wouldn't they steal your original language? I have a lot of questions. Then I start thinking about what we do in labs today. And if we do crazy things in labs today, um, I'm not gonna take away that they wasn't doing crazy things in labs back then. And we're just being lied to. I mean, we're forced, to believe, that there's this higher being, whether, some of us call him God and Jesus and the angels. And what if it's them? I mean, like, is there really a being with powers, like real powers? The way we know power today to be is someone that has rulership over you. Because I don't see any magical things happening per se, and it's just too much for me to sit and stand on a 2,000-year-old book, which is the Bible. And I'm not knocking anybody at all. Trust me. I respect everyone's belief. I respect everyone's coping mechanisms. My coping mechanism is Taoism. I like Taoism. I really do. That's my coping mechanism. Don't play with me. I might all of a sudden, y'all might see me get up out this seat without getting up and I just be floating up. So y'all be careful with me because I'm excelling in Taoism. Okay, so let's talk about what was going on in American soil in Europe at the same time. And this is how I can see how we can make sense. Okay. I went back to year 900. I know I could have went all the way back to 0, but I got tired because there's so many generations. And somebody made up these generation names, by the way. You'll get to know who they are. So I'm going to keep going back. I kept going back by generation in Europe until we come forward to when they come here. I mean, this is the story that's led to believe. And the more I read, I'm like, I don't know. We'll figure it out together. But let's start doing some reading. I was trying to get Smoke to do this for you yesterday, but I couldn't get him to move and any of his kind of stuff. So, but this is my kind of stuff. So let's get it. Generational breakdowns across American soil and Europe during parallel times. So let's keep going. I'm just going to read, and we're starting in Europe. I could have easily started here, but I chose to start in Europe, and we'll be able to I'll be able to tell you what the Indians were doing over here. Because first of all, what you got to understand is all those names, we know this. Choctaw, Chickasaw, all those names were given to the Indian. Those weren't the original names. So you do know that, right? All those were given names. And they were based on the way the colonizers spelt them by the like, if I tell you I'm Cherokee, you're going to spell it the way it sounds to you. And, they gave the Indians these names of tribes. They named them, those 5 civilized tribes. Those are not the original names. So that is important to know. So in order for them to do that, there was some type of strong relationship. We do know that. So let's keep going. So the generational flow from Europe to America, these are generations, but we're going to start very early in Europe, and then find out what was going on over in Europe to cause them to migrate here. So let's get it. So me, like I said, I went back 1990 to year 990 through 1017. Now, of course, I got 800 and something years to go, generations to go back to get to year 1. Okay. But I didn't finish going back that far. So I said, I'll start here. And later on, because I'm telling you, I have a lot of slides. So in year 990 through 1017, the historical context. And this is about the people in these centuries, what they were doing. And in Europe, it was called the reprisal generation. Historical context is born at the tail end of the 10th century. They grew up, these people in this year grew up during the final waves of Viking incursions in Europe, the consolidation of Capetian dynasty in France, and the strengthening of the Holy Roman Empire under Otto III. This was a time of recurring feuds, invasions, and reprisals between kingdoms and local powers. Identity and values, known as reactive generation. They were shaped by cycles of retaliation and defense. Their values centered on loyalty to local rulers, martial resilience, and survival in a fragmented political landscape. Influence. As adults, they witnessed the fading of Viking threats, the rise of feudal bonds, and the growing authority of monarchs and the church. Their children, the awakening generation, would inherit a Europe ready for spiritual renewal and cultural consolidation. In the legacy, they represent the closing of the Viking Age, embodying the defense posture and reprisal mentality that gave way to the stability and awakening of the early 11th century. So now we move to the awakening generation. Y'all following with me? The awakening generation, which runs from year 1018 to 1043. Historical context. Born in early 11th century, they grew up during the consolidation of the Holy Roman Empire under Conrad II and Henry III, and the strengthening of papal authority before the investiture controversy. This was also the period when Viking raids were subsiding, allowing Europe to stabilize and expand. Identity and values, known as idealistic generation. They were shaped by renewed faith, cultural awakening, and the beginnings of reform. Their values emphasize spiritual devotion, moral order, and the pursuit of stability after centuries of external invasion. Influence. As adults, they supported the early reform movements in the church, the spread of Romanist architecture, and the consolidation of feudal society. Their children, the conquest generation, would inherit a Europe ready for territorial expansion and dynastic struggles. The legacy, they represent early medieval awakening, laying the cultural and spiritual foundations that would later be tested by conquest, crisis, and reform. So now we get to the conquest generation, which is 1044 to 1069. Born in mid-11th century, they grew up during the rise of feudal monarchies and the great territorial struggles of the age. This was the era of the Norman conquest, 1066, the consolidation of kingdoms in England and France, and the growing clash between secular rulers and the papacy. Known as a civic generation, they were shaped by campaigns of conquest and consolidation. Their values centered on loyalty to lords and kings, military service, and the building of new feudal orders. Their influence. As adults, they fought in the Norman conquest, expanded feudal institutions, and witnessed the growing power of monarchs like William the Conqueror. Their children, the crisis generation, would inherit the instability of church state conflict and famine. The legacy, they represent the foundations of high medieval feudalism, establishing new dynasties and territorial structures that would dominate Europe for centuries. So now we're in the crisis generation, which is year 1070 to 1098. Born during the late 11th century, they grew up amid investiture controversy, conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV, and recurring instability across Europe. This was a time of famine, political fragmentation, and spiritual upheaval. Known for a reactive generation, they were shaped by turmoil and uncertainty. Their values centered on survival, loyalty to the lords of factions, and navigating the breakdown of authority between church and crown. Influence. As adults, they lived through the height of papal imperial conflict, excommunication, and civil wars. Their children, the Restoration generation, inherited Europe, desperate for stability, which they worked to rebuild after the First Crusade. They represent the low point of medieval order, embodying the struggles that forced Europe into reform and restoration. Their suffering and instability set the stage for the adaptive restoration generation that followed. So now we're in the Restoration generation, 1099 to 1124. Born in the wake of First Crusade and the capture of Jerusalem, which I found to be interesting. Born in the wake of the First Crusade and the capture of Jerusalem. They grew up during a Europe energized by religious triumph and papal authority. This was also the period of rebuilding after the investiture controversy, when the church and crown struggled for dominance. Identity and values, known as the adaptive generation. They focused on restoring order and stability after decades of upheaval. Their values emphasized resilience, consolidation of institutions, and cautious optimism in the wake of Crusader victories. Influence. As adults, They helped stabilize monarchies, expand monastic orders, and strengthen papal influence. Their children, the Reformed generation, would inherit this restored order and push it further into moral and institutional zeal. They represent the bridge between chaos and reform, laying the groundwork for the 12th century wave of religious and institutional renewal. I know, Copper. So now we're in the Reform generation, 1125 to 1150. Born in early 12th century, they grew up during the height of Gregorian reforms. Y'all know the Gregorian calendar, right? And the consolidation of papal authority. This was the age of church councils, canon law codification, and the strengthening of monastic orders like the Cistercians. Known as an idealistic generation, they were shaped by reformist zeal. Their values centered on moral purity, religious discipline, and institutional correction. They believed society could be renewed through faith and order. As adults, they advanced church reforms, expanded monastic networks, and supported crusading movements. Their children, the revival generation, inherited a Europe already reshaped by reform and carried forward the work of resilience and rebuilding. The revival generation, 1151 to 1176. Born in the mid 12th century, they grew up during Europe's recovery from earlier waves of instability. This was the age of renewed urban growth, cathedral construction, and the consolidation of royal authority. The papacy was strong, and crusading fervor was rising, setting the stage for their children's militant zeal. Known as an adaptive generation, they valued resilience, rebuilding, and pragmatic faith. Their worldview emphasized restoring stability after prior conflicts while cautiously embracing expansion and reform. As adults, they helped reestablish towns, guilds, and local governance and supported the papacy's cause for crusades. Their children, the Crusader generation, would inherit the momentum and channel it into militant campaigns abroad. The Crusader generation, 1177 to 1202. Born in the buildup of the Third Crusade, this generation grew up in Europe gripped by religious zeal, papal authority, and dynastic ambition. Their youth was shaped by rivalry between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin and the growing power of monarchs like Philip II or France and Frederick Barbarossa. Known as a reactive generation, they were driven by militant faith, loyalty to crown and cross, and a belief in divine mission. Their worldview was shaped by pilgrimage, conquest, and defense of Christendom. As adults, they launched and fought in the Third and Fourth Crusades, expanded feudal militarism, and deepened the divide between East and West. Their children, the Liberty generation, would inherit the legal and civic backlash to Crusader excess, including Magna Carta and rising calls for accountability. They represent the height of Crusader fervor, where spiritual conviction merged with political ambition. Their actions reshaped Europe's relationship with the Holy Land, Byzantium, and its own internal balance of power. The Liberty generation, 1203 to 1228. Born during the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople, this generation grew up in a fractured Christendom. The papacy was asserting dominance, while monarchs like Frederick II and Philip II of France expanded centralized power. Magna Carta emerged during their youth, marking a turning point into legal rights and resistance to tyranny. Known as the civic generation, they were shaped by rising demands for liberty, law, and accountability. Their values centered on justice, feudal reform, and the balance between royal authority and communal rights. As adults, they pushed for charters, legal codification, and institutional checks on monarchs. They laid the groundwork for constitutional thought and the rise of parliaments. Their children, the Enlightenment generation, would take these civic structures and infuse them with intellectual rigor. The Enlightenment generation, born in the 13th century, they grew up during the height of medieval intellectual expansion. This was the age of universities, Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, the codification of canon law, and the flourishing of scholastic philosophy. Monarchs were consolidating power while the papacy asserted authority across Europe. Known as the adaptive generation, they valued learning, rational inquiry, and institutional order. Their worldview was shaped by the blending of faith and reason, with thinkers like Thomas Aquinas beginning to synthesize classical philosophical with Christian theology. As adults, they advanced education, law, and governance. They laid the intellectual groundwork that their children, the awakening generation, would transform into spiritual fervor and cultural revival. The awakening generation, born in the mid 13th century, they grew up in the era of relative stability under strong monarchs like Louis IX of France and Edward I of England, but also amid growing tensions between secular rulers and papacy. This was the age of crusades, cathedral building, and scholastic learning. Known as the idealistic generation, they were shaped by spiritual fervor and cultural awakening. Their values centered on faith, moral order, and the pursuit of higher learning. Okay, we're just going to keep flying through the generations. Now we have the reprisal generation, 1282 to 1314. Born in the 13th century, they grew up amid escalating conflicts between monarchs, nobles, and the church. This was the era of Edward I's campaign in Wales and Scotland, the suppression of the Knights Templar, and mounting tensions that would spill into the 100 Years of War. So I think just reading the first paragraph, because remember, this will be February's newspaper. The other one was January. So this would be February 2026's newspaper. So now we're at the conquest, Jen. So I'm going to quickly go through these because I want to get to America. Born during the Great Famine and the early phases, the 100 Years' War, Europe was already destabilized by crop failures, food shortages, and rising conflict before the plague struck. The crisis generation, born during the lead up to and peak of the Black Death, which was 1347 to 1351. That's 4 years. This generation came of age in Europe, devastated by plague, famine, and war. Entire villages vanished. Labor systems collapsed, and the church's authority was taken. Known as the reactive generation, they were shaped by survival. Their values centered on endurance, improvisation, and spiritual reckoning. Many turned to mysticism, flagrant movements, or radical reforms by institutions failed them. The Black Death. Okay. I thought this was interesting. This Black Death, 1347 to 1351. It was 4 years it went on. The Black Death was a bubonic plague pandemic that occurred in Europe from 1347 to 1351. It was one of the most fatal pandemics in human history. As many as 50 million people perished, perhaps 50% of Europe's 14th century population. That's insane. It is now widely accepted that the plague was caused by Yersinia pestis bacteria, close Yersinia pestis bacteria, the bacteria that was responsible for plague, which was often transferred from rats to people by fleas. Although this wasn't understood at the time. At the time, they didn't understand this. So they're saying that this was a bacteria that was responsible for plague. And they're saying which was often transferred from rats to people by fleas. Oh my goodness. Hold up. Let me just think about that for a minute, y'all. Hold up. They're saying from this disease was transferred from rats to people by fleas. So if you have fleas, they was, oh my goodness. I hold up, let me take this down for a minute. Cause see, when you get when you grow up in the Bible, reading the Bible, we all did. Many of us did. I was thinking about, like in the Bible when it said that it would have, bugs come on the earth and torture you and kill you. Y'all remember that verse in the Bible? Come on the land and torture you and stuff. Remember that? Something like that in the Bible. Yeah, the plagues. And it was saying that something to that extent, like bugs would come up on this earth and something like that and torture the people. I mean, to have like 50%, that just like freaked me out, you guys. So my thing is, for something like this to happen, this plague, it takes inhuman to do something inhuman like that. I mean, how does this happen? I mean, it came from rats to fleas to people, and it like wiped out 50% of Europe. I'm like, what the heck? Did somebody do something or poison? Were the rats poisoned? I don't know. That sounds like really weird to me. If it's transferred from rats to fleas, that is very disturbing to me. Anyway, the restoration generation, born as Europe was slowly recovering from the devastation of the Black Death and ongoing turmoil of hundreds of the 100 Years' War. Their childhood was marked by rebuilding population, trade, and local institutions. So these people had, the Europeans had great building ability, obviously. Their childhood was marked by rebuilding population, trade, and local institutions. And this is in the 1300s. So they had some skills. They're the adapted generation. They as adults. They focused on restoring stability and catastrophe. They value resilience, rebuilding, and cautious optimism. As adults, they help reestablish towns, guilds, and local governance. Okay. So their children would then move, we then move into the crisis generation, born just before the printing press in the 1450s and the fall of Constantinople. Their formative years saw the first stirrings of European maritime exploration, Portugal's voyages down the African coast, and early Italian navigation experiments. Known as an idealistic generation, they were shaped by curiosity, invention, and the desire to expand horizons. They grew up in a Europe still medieval in structure, but beginning to imagine a wider world. As adults, they launched the earliest voyages that would inspire the discovery generation to push further, eventually opening the Americas. Uh-oh, here we come. So now the discovery generation. They were born during the late Middle Ages, just before Columbus's voyage in 1492. Okay, it's a lot of controversy regarding if this guy exists or was he somebody else, Fernand, I don't know. But I'm just reading it because that's what I learned as a little kid. Christopher Columbus, 1492. So it is what it is. Their formative years saw the rise of European exploration, the invention of the printing press in the 1450s, and the fall of Constantinople, which shifted trade routes and spurred exploration. Known as an adaptive generation, they grew up in a world of transition between medieval structures and the dawn of modern exploration. They valued opportunity, navigation, and discovery. As adults, they launched the age of discovery. Columbus, da Gama, and Cabot were all part of this cohort. Their explorations opened the Americas, Africa, and Asia to European expansion. Okay, y'all. We're coming along. The Reform generation, 1492 to 1516. Born during the age of Columbus's voyage and the dawn of European expansion into the Americas, they grew up in a Europe that was beginning to question old structures while simultaneously launching exploration and conquest overseas. Known as the idealistic generation, they were shaped by the spirit of reform, both in religion and in society. They saw the beginnings of challenges to Catholic authority and the first spark of Protestant dissent. As adults, they witnessed the opening of the New World, the rise of Spain and Portugal as colonial powers, and the early debates about faith and governance that would explode in the Reformation. They raised the reprisal generation, which is from 1517 to 1541, who lived through the direct upheavals of Martin Luther's Reformation. Their era marks the pivot from medieval Europe into the modern age. So now we got, what was that all about? I just show this little map, the Renaissance generation, the Reformation, the Pilgrim. Let's just keep going. The Pilgrim generation. Here we go, y'all. We're getting there. Now we're finally in America. I know, Kahib, right? It's really something great to listen to while you're drinking coffee. So we're now in America. This is where it's going to get heated, y'all. The Pilgrim generation, 1591, supposedly 1619, okay? Born at the end of the 16th century, they grew up amid religious persecution in England, the lingering effects of the Protestant Reformation, and the search for freedom of worship. Their adulthood coincided with the voyage of the Mayflower, 1620, and the founding of Plymouth Colony. Now, this is stuff that I learned in school as elementary. Identity value. Known as reactive generation, they resisted the established Church of England and sought separation. Their values centered on religious independence, covenant community, and survival in a new land. Survival in a new land. As adults, they became the first wave of settlers in New England, negotiating with native peoples enduring harsh winters and drafting the Mayflower Compact in 1620, a foundational document for self-governance in America. I would like to see that document. So this is the part where I'd be wanting to ask A1, okay, this is the first time they came here. As adults, they became the first wave of settlers in New England, negotiating with native peoples, enduring harsh winters, and drafting the Mayflower Compact in 1620, a foundational document for self-governance in America. So their colonies self-governing themselves. So they negotiated this with the Indians here. So y'all got that as a check mark, right? Kahi, Copper, Lady Libra, hey y'all. So they negotiated for self-governance so they can govern themselves. They got permission from the Indians here. So the key figures were William Bradford, born 1590, governor. He was the governor of Plymouth Colony. And then John Carver, first governor of Plymouth. Everyday pilgrims, families, and separatists who risked everything to establish a new community. They represent the founders of separatist America, whose survival and governance experiments laid the groundwork for the Puritan generation that's coming 1620 to 1647, which expanded settlement and built enduring institutions. Okay, so now we're with the Puritan generation. So I mean, they got permission from the Indians to self-govern here, okay, because they were originally, okay, let's just read, so I don't want to throw you off. The Puritan generation, born during the early settlement of New England, they grew up in the aftermath of the Pilgrim landing at Plymouth in 1620 and the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Their formative years were shaped by migration, religious zeal, and the struggle to build stable communities in a new land. All right. Known as an idealist generation, they emphasize strict moral codes, religious discipline, and community conformity. Their worldview was deeply tied to covenant theology, the belief that society must live according to God's law. As adults, they created the cultural and religious foundations of New England. They established Harvard College in 1636 to train ministers, organize town meetings, and enforce church covenants. Their rigid moral order sparked resistance and later cohorts by their institution building ensured the survival of the colonies. Okay. So this is why I, pause and sit back and say, well, wait a minute. I mean, I hear in YouTube on some lectures that when they came from Europe, they didn't have any skills. They didn't know how to build shit. They didn't know how to do this. They didn't know how to do that. But when I look and I'm reading, it's saying that they established towns. And when you see the signs, establish this here and where I live, there, I mean, I'm hearing story. This is what I'm saying. It gets so controversial that those structures were there. They just moved the Indians out and went in. I don't know how to believe that because there's just not been enough proof. And I mean, it's before they left Europe, there were structures there that they built. So they built them here too, unless someone could debunk what I'm saying. I mean, I'm not saying none of it is true. It's just interesting to read and know. But I just am having a hard time that they came from Europe and had absolutely no skills and nothing. They seem to be organized. And I hear you, Copper. You're saying what tools did they bring to build with? These are all great questions because I mean they were half dead when they got off the Mayflower. So how are they gonna have all those tools to build the structures that's already over here? So that is the question, and that's why I have a hard time believing everything. Because how did they get the tools that they needed to build these structures? And me, I'm a person that's scared of heights. So how the hell did they get these high structures over here and built, places like the Capitol and these big castles? What tools did they use? I mean, please don't tell me that they used like elephants and shit to lift things up high in the sky. I just can't. Something's not right here, and I need clarification. I'm not calling anybody a liar at this point. This is why I like to research because when you ask, when you see what's over here, and it wasn't a whole lot of them that came at this time from Europe, not in these years, and I'm like, where did they get the tools? How did they get these big, big, churches that they built with the big crosses on them? What tools did they use? How did they get way up in the sky? You got to? It doesn't make sense to me. We didn't have any like, they have like little elevators that bring you up. I forget what you call them. I just like to hear people teach. I want to hear people, give me some kind of may I say relief from this because I'm like, you came Massachusetts from Europe to Massachusetts down to New England. But where did you get the tools to build all these structures? This is why I said something's not right. Something's wrong with that with me. It doesn't. I mean, what tools? You did not use a chisel, and then the beautiful sculpturing of something's not right, y'all. That's where I'm stuck at, and I, would like to hear people that's educated in this to make it make sense to me because right now it doesn't make any sense. I'm seeing people running away from the story sounds right, leaving Europe for persecution and to be able to freely practice their religion. But when did they bring the tools when they came so they could build these structures? Or were these structures already here? Or was this just point blank? I don't know. Was this England? Is it a big secret? I want to know. But let's keep going. So we got the Puritans generation out. Let's keep going, you guys. So now we're in the colonial generation. Born in the mid 17th century, They grew up, these are the kids, this is how they grew up in the colonial. Born in the mid 17th century, they grew up during the consolidation of the English colonies in North America. Their youth was shaped by the aftermath of the English Civil War, the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, and the expansion of settlements in New England, Virginia, and the Carolinas. This was also the era of King Philip's War, which erupted just as they were entering adulthood. Hey, go forward. Hey, y'all. Identity and values. Known as a civic generation, they were builders and stabilizers. Their values emphasize community, local governance, and survival in a colonial environment. They established town meetings, local militias, and early legal codes and became the foundation of American civic life. As adults, they created the institutions that defined colonial society: self governing assemblies, churches, and schools. They defended settlements against native resistance and helped entrench the colonial order. Their children, the Enlightenment generation, would inherit these civic structures and infuse them with intellectual and rationalist ideas. Key figures during this colonial generation was Increase Mather, who was a Puritan minister and political leader influential in colonial governance. And then William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, champion of religious freedom, and everyday colonists who were farmers, artisans, and militia members who built the civic backbone of the colonies. Okay. So that's the more you read this, it's so interesting. So now we have the Enlightenment generation right here. We're in colonial times out now, y'all. 1674 to 1700. So now their kids were born in late 17th century as the colonies were stabilizing after their founding. Their youth coincided with the age of enlightenment, when European ideas of reason, science, and intellectual progress began to filter into colonial life. This was also the era of Glorious Revolution, 1688 in England, which reshaped political thought in the colonies. Known as the adaptive generation, they valued learning, rational inquiry, and exploration. Their worldview emphasized the power of reason, natural rights, and pursuit of knowledge. And the influence as adults, they absorbed Enlightenment philosophy and applied it to colonial society. They laid the groundwork for both the spiritual revivalism of the awakening generation and the political rebellion of the liberty generation. The key figures during this time: Ben Franklin, who was born in 1706, born just after, but shaped by their intellectual legacy; and Cotton Mather, a transitional figure blending Puritan tradition with Enlightenment curiosity. And then colonial thinkers and educators who began to spread rationalist ideas in America. So they represent the bridge between Puritan order and revolutionary spirit. Their embrace of reason and intellectual curiosity set the stage for both spiritual awakening and political independence. So now, if we're in um, this period, set 1674 to 1700, and then you have the 1701 to 1723. Ben Franklin was born in 1706. So he's coming up next because he was just born. So now he was born in the Ben Franklin was born in the awakening generation, and we'll get to him later. They were born into early 18th century, a time of colonial expansion, rising prosperity, and growing tension between traditional authority and new spiritual movements. Their formative years coincided with the First Awakening, 1730s to 1740s, a wave of revivalist preaching that swept across the colonies. Known as an idealistic generation, they were deeply shaped by spiritual fervor, moral conviction, and cultural awakening. Their values emphasized faith, renewal, and the search for higher meaning beyond material prosperity. As adults, they became the revivalists and reformers of colonial America. They filled churches, challenged established clergy, and spread new ideas of personal salvation and equality before God. Their children, the Liberty generation, would inherit this spirit of resistance and channel it into political rebellion against Britain. Okay, y'all, here we go. Key figures. Jonathan Edwards, who was born in 1703, he was a fiery preacher of sinners in the hands of an angry God. And George Whitefield, born in 1714, charismatic revivalist who toured the colonies. Everyday colonists, farmers, artisans, and women who embraced revivalism and reshaped community life. They represent the spiritual awakening at the prepared America for revolution. By challenging authority in the pulpit, they laid the cultural groundwork for challenging authority in government. Okay? So now, the Liberty generation, they grew up during the buildup of the American Revolution. As young adults, they were the ones who fought in the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783 and pushed for independence from Britain. Their formative years were marked by colonial unrest, taxation without representation, and resistance to imperial control. Known as a reactive generation, they were defined by rebellion against oppression. Their values centered on liberty, resistance, and collective action against the crown. The key figures: Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. Remember when Spanky from the Little Rascals, some of y'all probably wasn't born, he said that, give me liberty, friends, enemies. Funny. But Patrick Henry, 1736, he was born, and his famous phrase, give me liberty or give me death. And then Samuel Adams organized, he organized the Sons of Liberty, y'all. Remember I told y'all about the Sons of Liberty where they put that Worcester on their face? We'll get there. And then Thomas Jefferson in 1743, slightly younger but shaped by his cohort, author of the Declaration of Independence. He wrote that Declaration of Independence. He was one of the authors. They were the fighters and revolutionaries who broke the colonies free from Britain. Their struggle laid the foundation for the Republican generation, 1767 to 1791, who then stabilized the new republic and built civic institutions. Now, we're in the Republican generation, 1767 to 1791, stabilization of the new nation. They were children during the American Revolution and young adults as the Constitution was ratified in 1787. Their formative years were marked by the fragile beginnings of the United States, debates over federal versus state power, and the establishment of democratic institutions. Identity and values. Known for their civic mindedness, they emphasized Republican ideas, citizenship, virtue, and participation in governance. They inherited the revolutionary spirit, but focused on stabilizing and legitimizing the new nation. Key figures was James Monroe. He was born in 1758, slightly earlier but influential as president during their adulthood. John Quincy Adams, he was born in 1767, a direct member of this generation, later became the sixth U.S. president. And then leaders, thinkers, and reformers who bridged the revolutionary era with the early 19th century. Influence on later generations. Their efforts were to secure the republic, lay the groundwork for the transcendental generation, which shifted toward reform, spirituality, and individual conscience. The transcendentalists inherited the political framework created by the Republicans, but sought to expand it into cultural and moral realms. Citizenship, what year? Oh, you want me to go back? Let me see. Fragile begins of federal. No, okay. This was the Republican generation. We're in the generation of the Republican. The Republican 1767 and 1791. Kahi. It says they were the children during the American Revolution and the young adults as the Constitution was ratified in 1787. Their formative years were marked by fragile beginnings of the United States, debates over federal versus state power, and the establishment of democratic institutions. And then it got into identity and their values. They were known for their civic mindedness. They emphasized Republican ideas, citizenship, virtue, and participation in governance. They inherited the revolutionary spirit, but focused on stabilizing and legitimizing the new nation. Kind of what we're going through now. So now, in this era, the color Indians' perspective in this era, by the 1790 census, categories hardened into white, black, and mulatto. Indian only appeared for those not taxed, living outside mainstream society. Indians who farmed, paid taxes, or lived in towns were often erased from the Indian category. Result: dark-skinned Indians in Virginia, the Carolinas, and New England were increasingly recorded as colored or Negro. This erased tribal identity on paper, even while families maintained Indian traditions in practice. And the legal strategy: states collapsed Indians into color to avoid treaty obligations and land claims. This was deliberate erasure, not accident. Now, the generational impact. Children of the Republican generation grew up with their Indian identity erased in official records. By the time their children, the transcendental generation, came of age, the erasure was entrenched, setting up the identity crisis we've been tracing into the 1850 census. The Republican generation was the bridge between revolutionary ideas and transcendental reform. For colored Indians, this was the moment when erasure hardened. They were deliberately collapsed into colored categories, stripping them of recognition while still living as Indians in practice. Give me a one if y'all with me and listening in. Okay, good. I see it. When census takers in the late 1700s and early 1800s said Indian not taxed or living outside mainstream society, they meant native people who were not integrated into the new American civic order. In practice, that phrase covered several realities: separate communities, Indians who remained in tribal villages, reservations, or communal lands rather than moving into towns or farms recognized by the state. No property on tax rolls. Families who didn't own taxable land or weren't counted in local property records were excluded from the citizen categories. That's why you got to look at those agriculture schedules. Yep. Okay. Let me stop jumping. Independent governance. Tribes that maintained their own leadership, laws, and treaties were considered outside the reach of U.S. civic institutions. Cultural distance. People who continued traditional lifeways, hunting, fishing, seasonal migration were seen as outside the settled agrarian model the republic valued. All right, keep listening, y'all. For dark-skinned Indian families who did farm, pay taxes, or lived in towns, this distinction was devastating because they were inside mainstream society. Census officials refused to list them as Indian. Instead, they were collapsed into colored or Negro. So outside mainstream society meant you could still be recognized as Indian. But if you were inside, working land, paying taxes, serving in the military, you were erased on paper. That's the paradox. The more you participated in the republic, the more your Indian identity was denied. Are y'all listening? The phrase Indian not taxed, living outside mainstream society, was a United States Census and legal category. So it applied specifically to Native peoples within the boundaries of the United States. For Central and South American Indians, the situation was different. Number one, United States Census context from the 1790s to the 1800s, the census only covered the United States. It did not enumerate indigenous people in Mexico, Central America, or South America. So Indians not taxed was never applied to them. Latin America context. In Spanish, Portuguese, and other colonial systems, indigenous people were classified differently. Categories like Indio, Mestizo, Mulatto, and Negro were used in caste systems, the casta hierarchy. These classifications were about race, ancestry, and social status, not taxation in the same way as the United States Census. Colored Indians parallel. The erasure pattern was similar, though expressed differently. In Latin America, darker skinned indigenous people were often collapsed into Negro or mulatto categories, while lighter skinned or mixed heritage individuals might be recorded as mestizo. This erased tribal identity in favor of racial categories, just as United States Census officials collapsed Indians into color. So I'm gonna stop there for a second and take a quick water break for like 2 minutes, you guys, because we're getting into reading some really great stuff now. So I want you to go get your little potty break or popcorn or heat up your tea or coffee, and I'll be right back. I'll just give you some music. I'll be right back. So, okay, so as you can see, we're moving in more into what actually happened, the disappearance of stuff. So this is interesting. What I just read to you was the comparison and letting you know that the United States um system after the Revolutionary War and the establishment of the states and different things of that nature, and the first census being in 1790. I was showing you the comparison of how Latin American um in Central and South America compared labeled the Indians in those areas compared to the way we did it. They did basically like kind of like the same thing, but they just labeled differently. And I'll read it one more time because I got up, to take a little break. And I want you to understand the comparison between like Central and South America and the way they did it here on the mainland. Two different governments. Their census sheets have nothing to do with United States because there are other areas, countries. So let's get it. So as we left off in Latin America context, in Spanish, Portuguese, and other colonial systems, indigenous people were classified differently. Categories like Indio, um, mestizo, mulatto, and negro were used in caste systems, the casta hierarchy. These classifications were about race, ancestry, and social status, not taxation in the same way as the United States Census. So the colored Indians paralleled that. The erasure pattern was similar though it was expressed differently. In Latin America, darker skinned indigenous people were often collapsed into Negro or mulatto categories, while lighter skinned or mixed heritage individuals might be recorded as mestizo. This erased tribal identity in favor of racial categories, just as United States officials collapsed Indians into colored. So now let's keep it moving. So now the colored Indians perspective in Florida. I thought this was so interesting. Colored Indians perspective, Florida and mainland before 1821. In Spanish Florida, we're talking 1513 to 1763 and 1783 to 1821. Spain offered refuge. Listen to this, y'all. Spain offered refuge to indigenous peoples. Okay, this is in Florida when it was not a part of the United States. Dark-skinned Indians who escaped enslavement or colonial control could live under Spanish protection, often being recognized if they converted to Catholicism or served military. These communities became the foundation of what later was called the Seminole. So I find that very interesting because we had a lot of Indians that were enslaved in the South and all over the South, and they learned that they could get protection from Spanish Florida if they came near and they converted to Catholicism and served in their military. And the most strikingly interesting thing is the colonists were sending their soldiers over to Florida to look for their runaway slaves. And they couldn't make the determination because the damn slaves looked just like the Spanish Florida people. They looked just alike. So you didn't know the difference. I found that they could not determine who was a runaway slave versus the Indians that was already there. They couldn't tell the difference because they looked just alike. So nobody left. They couldn't take them. And it's like, I'm like, wow, do you find that interesting? I mean, they sent, literally, the colonists sent their soldiers to go and look for the runaway slaves because they know they was all starting to run to Florida from all over. It didn't matter what part you were in the South. They knew that place in Florida was what is known now. Florida was a refuge, and when they sent the soldiers over there, they couldn't pick out. I mean, could you imagine just going on the land? We want our runaway slaves. They don't know who is who. It's like, so that tells you a lot about Spaniards. Hold on. In that time, and we're gonna get to why. So we got British Florida. Excuse me. 1763 to 1783. Britain imposed stricter racial categories, but indigenous groups resisted and maintained autonomy. even under British rule, Florida remained a place where runaway Indians regrouped and preserved their tribal identity. Second Spanish period between 1783 and 1821. Florida was a borderland where colored Indians lived outside U.S. Census categories. They were not collapsed into colored yet because U.S. law did not apply. This anonymity lasted until 1821. Interesting. After U.S. annexation in 1821 onward, once Florida became U.S. territory, the erasure pattern began. Dark-skinned Indians were increasingly classified as colored in census and legal records. The Seminole Wars were fought by these runaway Indians who established the Seminole tribe to resist erasure and defend their sovereignty. Spain offered, oh, we already read this. We already read that. It's a duplicate. My bad. So, before Florida, before U.S. control. Now, Florida, what we need to know, an interesting thing about Florida, Florida was not part of the United States until 1821. It became a U.S. territory in 1822 and a state in 1845. So Florida before U.S. control, claimed and ruled by Spain after Juan Ponce de Leon's arrival. St. Augustine was founded in 1565, the oldest European settlement in the continental U.S. In 1763 to 1783, controlled by Great Britain after the 7 Years' War. Britain divided it into East Florida and West Florida. From 1783 to 1821, returned to Spain after the American Revolution, the Second Spanish period. Spain held Florida until the Adams-Honest Treaty of 1819, which ceded it to the United States. Formal transfer was in 1821. Florida, under U.S. control, in 1821, officially transferred from Spain to the United States. In 1822 to 1845, organized as the Florida Territory. From 1845, admitted as the 27th United States. All right, so let's keep going, y'all. So now, I paused for a minute and I was like, and you can read this. I always put this link in the chat when I read it. It's Ben. Ben is giving his description in his transcript. Y'all know Benjamin Franklin wrote in his 1751 essay, Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind. He was reflecting on population growth and racial categories as he understood them in the mid-18th century. Franklin's description of Europeans. He explicitly called Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, Swedes, and Germans swarthy, meaning darker skin compared to the Saxons and English, whom he considered the principal body of white people. This shows that even within Europe, complexion was seen as varied, and purely white was considered rare. It's not a lie, but a perspective. Franklin was fabricating. Franklin wasn't fabricating. So they're saying that it's not a lie, but a perspective. Franklin wasn't fabricating. He was describing how Europeans looked to him and his contemporaries. Swarthy at the time meant dark complexions, often olive or brown tone. So yes, Spaniards were widely recognized as darker skinned, especially compared to Northern Europeans. For real, for real. Benjamin wrote in his essay, observing observations concerning the increase of mankind. He was reflecting on the population growth and racial categories as he understood them in the main sense. Why is this printing type? Spanish identity in the Americas. This matters for our narrative. When Spain ruled Florida and much of the Americas, the Spanish themselves were not seen as pure white by Anglo standards. They were closer in complexion to the indigenous peoples they governed. That's why Spanish colonial society had different racial categories: Indio, Mestizo, Mulatto, and Negro, instead of the rigid white/colored binary that the U.S. later imposed. Colored Indians' perspective. For dark-skinned Indians, this meant Spanish rule did not erase them into color the way U.S. law did. Spain recognized them as Indians, especially if they converted to Catholicism or allied military. The erasure pattern only hardened after 1821, when United States racial categories took over Florida. Y'all with me? This is wild, right? It's interesting. Transcendental generation, which was 1792 to 1821. Colored Indians in the transcendental generation, 1792 to 1821, were native families who, because of their darker skin tone and farming lifestyles, were deliberately reclassified in census and legal records as colored rather than Indian. This was part of a broader erasure strategy during the early republic. These were the children of the Revolutionary era, coming of age during the War of 1812 and the rise of reformist intellectual movements like transcendentalism in the 1830s and 1840s. By this period, census categories were limited to white, black, and mulatto. Indian was only used for those not taxed, living on reservations, or outside mainstream society. Dark-skinned Indians who farmed, paid taxes, or lived in mixed communities were often recorded as colored. This erased their tribal identity on paper while they continued to live as Indians in practice. So when I read that, when I first read that paragraph right there, I'm like, well, wait a minute. They probably didn't even freaking know. Because I mean, like, if you're managing something, you could literally not know your shit is being erased before your eyes and not even know it, because you're not a office person keeping paperwork, and this shit is just because they put you down as color. You don't know that I'm seeing this just like today. They put you in these categories, but you don't know that they're erasing you because no one's jumping up talking about it. So subconsciously, they're working on their farms. They don't know that they're being erased in this manner. And I could see that happening. Do y'all understand where I'm coming from when I say that? Because it's like your parent, you think of your parents that, don't have a high education, maybe third grade or church education at this point, and somebody's tracking paper on you, but you don't know that's what it's doing to you. You're just farming on your land, you're paying your taxes, and you live in a mixed community, living as an Indian, okay? And you don't know that this category is literally what's raising your identity. So I'm like, wow. That's how it's done. Transcendental generation defined. The names come from William Strauss and Neil Howe's generational theory. They map out U.S. history into recurring cycles and gave each generation a label titled to its cultural mood. So these gentlemen are the one who, gave the generational names, and we just kept it going as we moved forward. So the Transcendental Generation was named after the Transcendentalist movement that flourished in the 1830s and 40s when this cohort was in young adulthood. These were the thinkers, reformers, and activists who pushed beyond traditional institutions, emphasizing individual conscience, spirituality, and social reform. So, white male leaders in the Transcendental Generation, 1792 to 1821. Ralph Waldo, he was a philosopher and essayist who led the Transcendentalist movement. Then you had Henry David Thoreau, author of Walden and Civil Disobedience, known for his nature writing and anti-slavery stance. Then Nathan Hawthorne, he was a novelist who explored moral complexity in Puritan New England. And then you got William Lloyd Garrison, radical abolitionist and publisher of The Liberator. And you got Horace Mann, education reformer who pushed for public schooling. That was in 1796. And Charles Finney in 1792, evangelist who led the Second Great Awakening. This is so interesting. So, example of colored Indians in this era. So, like in Virginia and in the Carolinas, tribes like the Pamunkey, Nottoway, and Catawba were frequently labeled colored in local records despite maintaining tribal governance. New England, here in New England, in the Connecticut and Rhode Island, Pequots, Narragansetts, and Mohegans often appear in town records as colored or Negro, even when church rolls and oral traditions identified them as Indian. That's wild. North Carolina, Cherokee families who remained after removal acts were sometimes listed as free color persons in county tax rolls. This is why I love this is why I love researching. I mean, literally, they're telling you, and I'm glad this information is probably it's always been out here. It's just that unfortunately in earlier years, our people were not, understanding on how to find this information. But I just think that I'm born in these days and able to share it, to bring some um what may I say, warmth in your heart and comfort. When I read this, I was like, wow. And it really makes you feel a whole lot better. Like, again, Virginia and Carolina. This is 1792 to 1821. Tribes like the Pamunkey, Nottoway, and Catawba were frequently labeled colored in local records despite maintaining tribal governance. Now, here in New England, New England is huge. To me, it is. The Pequots, there are a lot of Indians. The Narragansetts and the Mohegans often appeared in town records as colored or Negro, even when church rolls and oral traditions identified them as Indian. And then in North Carolina, the Cherokee families who remained after removal acts were sometimes listed as free colored persons in the county tax rolls, but they was Indians. So, the same generation, same land, two realities. Transcendental transcendental reformers. I got a comparison here. Ralph Waldo, colored Indians, erased farmers. Ralph Waldo Emerson, philosophers of spiritual truth, Catawba, Pequot, Pamunkey, Nottoway, and Narragansett. Erased farmers. These are erased farmers who were Indians, colored Indians that were erased. Henry David Thoreau, nature writer and abolitionist, labeled colored in census records. William Lloyd Garrison, radical anti-slavery publisher, denied tribal identity and treaty rights. Horace Mann, education reformer, buried in agricultural rolls and tax ledgers, erased, mislabeled, forgotten. Charles Finney, revivalist, preacher, celebrated. While white reformers preached transcendence, dark-skinned Indians were reclassified out of existence. Why this happened? Legal strategy. By collapsing Indians into colored, states avoided treaty obligations and land claims. Social control. It reinforced the racial binary, white versus black, and erased indigenous identity from official recognition. Generational impact. Children born in this era, 1792 to 1821, grew up with their Indian identity erased in official records, setting the stage for later generations, like the missionary and lost generations, to fight for recognition. The Gilded generation, born between 1822 and 1842, came of age during a time of explosive economic growth, industrialization, and social inequality, the early phase of what would later be called the Gilded Age. They were born 1822 to 1842, came of age 1840s to the 1860s, which was the antebellum period in the Civil War. Historical role, they were the builders of industry, soldiers in the Civil War, early capitalists. Cultural mood, pragmatic, ambitious, materialistic, often skeptical of idealism. Pragmatism over idealism. Unlike transcendental generation before them, they were less focused on philosophy and more on results, building railroads, factories, and fortunes. Civil War veterans. Many fought in the war, especially on the Union side, and emerged hardened by conflict. Industrial pioneers. They laid the groundwork for the Gilded Age's titans: steel, oil banking, and rail. Social conservatism. They often resisted radical reform, preferring order and hierarchy. For dark-skinned American Indians born during this era, census records 1850 to 1870 continued to label them colored or mulatto, especially if they lived off the reservation. Legal erasure intensified, and land privatization and industrial expansion accelerated. Tribal claims were further suppressed. Military service. Some served in the Civil War but were recorded as colored soldiers, erasing tribal affiliation. Cultural survival. Despite paper erasure, many families maintain oral traditions, tribal surnames, and community ties. So, erased on paper, rooted in land. Same generation, same land, two realities. Builders of industry, born 1822 to 1842, came of age in 1840s and 1860s. Railroad factories, Civil War soldiers, pragmatic, materialistic, ambitious, laid the groundwork for the Gilded Age, wealth, and inequality, celebrated as pioneers of progress. And when you look over on the other side, it's showing what was going on with the Indians around this time. Dark-skinned native families mislabeled colored in census records 1850 to 1870. Tribal surnames buried under racial categories. Land and labor tied them to community survival. Civil War service recorded as colored, erasing tribal identity. Erased in records, but rooted in land and lineage. Why this generation matters to our people today in 2026. That's because it's going to be in February. They were the parents of the missionary generation, 1860 to 1882, meaning their erasure directly shaped the next wave of identity confusion. Their paper trail is critical. 1850 and 1860 census records often show the transition from Indian to colored, especially in agricultural communities. They lived through the legal tightening of racial categories, the moment when being Indian on paper became nearly impossible unless you were federally recognized. Progressive generation from 1843 to 1859, reform-minded, shaped by Civil War and Reconstruction, pushed for modernization and civic reform, reform-minded, civic duty-oriented, advocated modernization in education, infrastructure, and governance. Many became leaders in the early progressive movement of the late 19th century. Theodore Roosevelt, who was born in 1858, emblematic of reform and modernization. Booker T. Washington, 1856, educator and leader in African American advancement. Now, don't believe the hype because African American did not exist in those days. Booker T. Washington, to me, based on what I seen, he was Indian. Enslaved Indians, 1600 to 1700, absorbed into slavery records. Reclassified as colored, 1800s, tribal identity erased on paper. Booker T. Washington, born 1856, born into slavery, identity shaped by color. Lost generation, 1883 to 1900s, grew up under erasure, carrying the confusion forward. Booker T. Washington did not attend a formal elementary school in the way we think of today. He was born enslaved in 1856 in Franklin County, Virginia. As a child, he had no access to structured schooling. His earliest education came from secretly, y'all get it? Listen to this. His earliest education came from secretly learning to read and write while working in the salt furnaces and coal mines of Malden, West Virginia. Make that make some damn sense. He took a break while he was in the coal mines of Malden, West Virginia. And he was secretly learning how to read and write. While he in the coal mines, y'all. I just can't. This shit is hilarious. Let's keep going. Booker T. Washington's early education path. Childhood. From 1856, this is what I'm picking up. Born into slavery, he had no formal schooling during his earliest years. Post-emancipation after 1865, when his family moved to Malden, West Virginia, Washington worked long hours in the mines, but was determined to learn. First, schooling. He attended a small school for Black children in Malden, taught by a local minister. He often had to leave work early or study at night to attend. The local minister who first taught Booker T. Washington after emancipation in Malden, West Virginia, was Reverend William Davis, a black preacher who opened a small school for African American children, y'all. In these days, the word African American was used. I'm done. Was not used. Self-education. Washington carried a spelling book with him and practiced letters whenever he could. Later studies. His persistence led him to Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia, now Hampton University, where he received a formal training and later became a teacher himself. Why dark-skinned Indians were labeled colored in the 1850s. Census practices. Enumerators were instructed to classify people by appearance, not by community identity. If someone had dark skin, they were often marked colored or Negro, even if their family and records said Indian. Legal erasure. Many Eastern tribes, like the Cherokee, the Pequot, and Lumbee, who stayed on their lands after removal acts, were deliberately reclassified to strip them of treaty rights. Colored was a bureaucratic way to erase sovereignty. Farm context. Agricultural communities in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Connecticut often had Indian families working their own land. Census takers lumped them into color to simplify categories and deny recognition. Social control. By collapsing Indians into colored, the government reinforced a racial binary, white versus black, and erased indigenous identity from official records. From Indian to colored, 1850 census erasure. Early colonial record listing Indian families, 1850 census page labeling them colored. Census takers classified by appearance, not heritage. Dark-skinned Indians lumped into colored category. Legal erasure stripped tribes of recognition and rights. Descendants forced to fight for identity generations later. The irony. Families who were documented as Indian in earlier colonial records suddenly became colored in census rolls. Generations later, descendants had to fight to prove their indigenous identity because the paper trail had been deliberately blurred. In the 1850s, color wasn't just a description, it was a policy tool to erase dark-skinned Indians from recognition. What seems laughable now was actually a calculated act of erasure. Missionary generation from 1860 to 1882. These kids grew up during Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, became adults during the rise of industrialization, Jim Crow laws, and early civil rights activism. Known for founding institutions, pushing for social reform, and laying groundwork for the progressive era, included figures like Webb Du Bois and Jane Addams. So now we're at the lost generation. Okay. And the lost generation is people born from 1883 to 1900. The lost generation grew up in a rapidly changing world shaped by industrialization, conservative family values, and rising literacy, only to be thrust into trauma of the World War I as young adults. Childhood upbringing, family structure. The ideal was the father as breadwinner and authority figure, with the mother dedicated to home and children. Even poorer families tried to conform to this model. Multi-generational homes. It was common for 3 generations to live together under one roof. Servants in wealthier homes. Middle and upper class households often employed domestic servants, ranging from a single maid to larger staffs. Child welfare awareness. By the late 19th century, laws and societies were emerging to protect children from abuse, though corporal punishment was still widely accepted. Health and hygiene. Understanding of hygiene improved, and regular bathing became common in the 1890s. Social environment. Industrial revolution impact. They grew up in societies that were more literate, consumerist, and media saturated than ever before. Conservative social values. Despite modernization, family and social norms remain strict and conservative. Education and literacy. Access to schooling expanded, and newspapers, magazines, and novels shaped their worldview. Coming of age, lost generation. This is still the lost generation. World War I. As young men, they were mobilized en masse for the war. Millions fought, and many died or returned delusioned. Women's role. Young women contributed to the war effort and its aftermath, gained greater freedoms politically and socially. Spanish flu pandemic. This generation was heavily affected by the 1918 pandemic, which killed millions worldwide. Cultural expression. Their disillusionment fueled the creativity of expatriate writers in Paris, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Stein, who gave the generation its name. For dark-skinned American Indians born 1883 to 1900, they grew up under census erasure, often labeled colored instead of Indian. Their families inherited the confusion and denial of heritage from earlier generations misclassified on paper. As adults, they faced the same disillusionment as their peers, but carried an added burden, fighting for recognition of erased identity, while the mainstream world debated modernity and war. For the lost generation grew up in conservative, multi-generation households and entered adulthood during World War I and the Spanish flu, and became known for their disillusionment and cultural rebellion. For Native families mislabeled colored, this disorientation was compounded by identity erasure, making them lost, not only in spirit, but also on paper. The greatest generation, born in the years 1901 to 1927. Segregation defined identity. Colored was the legal and social category. Schools, buses, water fountains, hospitals, and cemeteries were divided. Education. Most colored children attended underfunded, segregated schools. Books were hand-me-downs from white schools. Higher education was rare, but HBCUs offered pathways. Work and economy. Families worked in agricultural, domestic service, and low-wage industrial jobs. That Great Depression, 1929 to 1939, hit colored households hardest. Community anchors, churches, lodges, and mutual aid societies provided dignity, resilience, and cultural continuity. So now we're now in the 30s, you guys, and because we were born 30 to 40 years later, then in this case, it would be what my grandmother grew up under. And these are the issues that my grandmother grew up under. And, they lived this life. And today, because we have so much opportunity, we can't even fathom um what they went through in their time. So this is why our grannies and great grannies raised us based on the way they experienced society. Their mind is traumatizing. They never came out of those mind states because they weren't really allowed to. So when they raised us on how to survive. And it was in a defensive manner because of what they had to fight and go through. The separate water fountains, um, the schools, the buses. Like by the time I was born, I went to a diverse elementary school and middle school and high school. Whereas in the South, it was predominantly um darker skinned people. They saw more of the uh brown teachers. Here in the North, it was different for me. I had a totally different experience. So I can understand why Southerners act the way that they do because it was worse in the South, the racism. I mean, I don't, I mean, I couldn't imagine walking down the street and you see a sign on the door, we only serve coloreds or we only serve whites. That's a crazy life to live. And I'm glad I wasn't born in those days. They say you whatever time you were born in is because you could, you could take it. But I can't imagine having that kind of lifestyle and not and then you can see why our parents didn't have trust. Now, I'm not saying that we don't discuss experience racism today, because then I'd be lying. But it's not to this extent, is basically what I'm saying. So that's very different. Coming of age, 1930s and 40s. So now we're at World War II service. As young adults, they fought in segregated military units, Tuskegee Airmen, 92nd Infantry Division. Native families, mislabeled color, also served, but their tribal identity was erased in records. Double burden. They fought for democracy abroad while denied full rights at home. This contradiction fueled the Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad and racism at home. And that's just like pretty tough. You go and fight in the world, but when you come home, that's painful. So I can understand the attitudes our men had and why a lot of them fell off and refused. A lot of our fathers that fought in these wars refused to go to church because to fight in such a dangerous war and then come home and be denied, I mean, that's painful. And again, I'm glad I wasn't born in those days. Many joined the migration northward, seeking factory jobs in Chicago, Detroit, and New York. The characteristics of color, and we're in the greatest generation now: resilient, survived poverty, segregation, and war. That's what they survived. Patriotic but disillusioned, served faithfully yet returned to discrimination. They were family oriented, strong kinship networks, often multi generational households. Cultural builders laid groundwork for gospel, blues, and civil rights activism. Indigenous perspective. Dark skin colored Indians born 1901 to 1927 were, where is this right here? Reclassified as colored in census records. They lived in segregated schools and communities, losing tribal recognition on paper. Oral traditions and surnames carried identity forward, even as official records denied it. Their service in World War II was recorded under colored, erasing tribal affiliation. The greatest generation from 1901 to 1927 is remembered for sacrifice and resilience. For those labeled colored, greatness meant enduring segregation, fighting abroad while denied rights at home, and preserving erased identities through family and community strength. Silent generation, born 19, these babies were born 1928 to 1945, which is my grandmother's generation, being born in 1931. And you see Malcolm X. The silent generation grew up during the Great Depression and World War II, came of age in the conservative 1950s, and is recommended for caution, conformity, loyalty, and resilience. Yet, they also produced leaders of the civil rights movement and the cultural revolutions of the 1960s. Their size smaller than the greatest generation and baby boomers due to low birth rates during the Depression and World War II. Nickname: traditionists, builders, lucky few. Historical context: childhood and scarcity, depression, Dust Bowl, wartime, rationing, adulthood and post-war prosperity. Child upbringing: economic hardship. Many were born into families struggling with unemployment, food shortages, and rationing. War years: as children, they lived through World War II. Fathers away fighting, mothers holding households together. Discipline and silence: raised with strict rules, children were expected to be seen but not heard. This shaped their cautious, conformist reputation. Coming of age, 1940s to 1960s, post war prosperity. Entered adulthood during booming and economic growth with strong corporate jobs, affordable housing, and pensions. Korean War: many served in Korea, often overshadowed by World War II veterans. The McCarthy era: fear of communism and backlisting encouraged conformity. Speaking out was risky. Civil rights leadership: despite the silent label, many leaders of the civil rights movement were silent. Martin Luther King Jr., born 1929, and John Lewis, born in 1940. Cultural contributions: rock and roll pioneers, Elvis Presley, um, who was born in 1935, and golden age of Hollywood stars, James Dean and Elizabeth Taylor. For coloreds and reclassified Indians, segregation reality: born into Jim Crow era, they attended colored schools, lived in segregated neighborhoods, and faced systemic exclusion. Military service: served in the segregated units during Korea. Records listed them as colored or Negro, erasing tribal identity. Civil rights activism: many silent generation colors became the backbone of the civil rights protests, sit-ins, and marches. Erasure continuity: dark-skinned Indians, mislabeled, colored, carried forward the generational burden of lost recognition, even as they fought for equality. The silent generation is remembered for caution, conformity, and loyalty shaped by depression and war. Yet they were also the lucky few who benefited from post war prosperity, and paradoxically, they produced some of the loudest voices for justice in civil rights and culture. For those labeled colored, this generation meant growing up under segregation, serving in a war without recognition, and fighting to reclaim erased identities. So this is just a comparison. We already went through that. I don't need to redo it again. So now we're in the boomer generation, 1946 to 1964. I still wasn't born yet, but y'all remember that picture. I remember that damn old little refrigerator. I remember that. I was looking at the background of this picture with the lady holding the baby. I remember that back. I swear I do. I mean, I wasn't born yet, but I remember them like little refrigerators. The boomer generation, 1946 to 1964. Post-war prosperity. White families enjoyed suburban expansion, GI Bill benefits, and booming schools. Segregation reality. Colored children were barred from many of these opportunities. Segregated schools, neighborhoods, and hospitals remained the norm until the mid 1960s. Language of identity, still officially colored or Negro in census schools and military records. African American was not yet in use. Characteristics of colored baby boomers: resilient and activists, grew up under segregation but fought to dismantle it. Community builders, churches and grassroots organizations became hubs of civil rights activism. Identity shifts. By the late 1960s, Black became a proud reclamation term, a turning point from color. The baby boomer generation is remembered for prosperity and rebellion. For those labeled colored, it was the generation of civil rights struggle, identity reclamation, and cultural power. They carried forward erased identities and began to speak them back into existence. African Americans still not used. So you get this, you know, photo with the 1960s and 70s. Okay. And you see the Indian, that, it's something that these movements, Generation X. Okay. We were babies. Okay. We weren't, we weren't the adults. So these would be like our parents and grandparents. So, but we were born, this is Generation X, but them being our parents. I remember our families wearing those long dresses to church on Sunday and those stockings. I remember this, and those hairstyles. That's just very 1970-ish. And then that rain hat. I remember those rain hats. Generation X, 1965 to 1980. So we're looking at the pictures. This is definitely back in the 70s because you're looking at the afros. We're coming out of the afros. That would be us as little children with the little afros. I remember this. Generation X is your cohort, often called the Latchy generation or the MTV generation. Gen Xers grew up with independence, skepticism, and adaptability, shaped by divorce rates, dual income households, and the rise of technology. About 65 million at that time in the US. Nicknames they gave us as Gen X: Latchy generation, MTV and BET generation, baby bus generation. Historical content: childhood in the 1970s and 1980s, adulthood in the 1990s and 2000s. Childhood and upbringing. Latchy kids. Many Gen Xers came home to empty houses due to rising divorce rates and working mothers. Independence and self-reliance. Learn to cook, fix things, and entertain themselves without constant adult supervision. That's a fact. Analog childhood. Grew up with landlines, payphones, VHS tapes, mixtapes, and Saturday morning cartoons. Gaming revolution. The first generation to experience Atari, Nintendo, and Sega console wars. Coming of age, MTV and pop culture, music videos, grunge, hip hop, punk, and alternative rock defined our youth. Cynicism and skepticism, often described as slackers or disaffected, but also resourceful and pragmatic. Historical events: end of the Cold War, Berlin Wall, 1989. Soviet collapses, 1991. The AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. Challenger explosion, 1986, and space shuttle milestones. War on drugs campaigns, just say no to drugs. That was our generation. For colored reclassified Indians, segregation legacy. Though legal segregation ended in the 1960s, Gen X, coloreds, Negroes, blacks grew up in its aftermath. Underfunded schools, housing discrimination, and systemic inequality. Identity shift. By the late 1960s and 70s, black became a proud reclamation term, but census and institutions still use Negro or colored into the early years of Gen X. Activism and culture. Gen X coloreds were part of the rise of hip hop, Black Power's legacy, and native sovereignty movements, reclaiming erased identities through art, protest, and community. African Americans still not used. For our parents' generation, they were labeled Negro in census records, military service, and schools. The label carried both respectability and erasure. It was seen as more formal than color, but it still denied indigenous ancestry for families reclassified on paper. Many of them lived through the civil rights movement, where Negro signs and organizations gave way to Black is Beautiful and identity reclamation. Indigenous context. For dark skinned Indians reclassified as Negro, tribal identity was erased even more deeply because Negro was seen as a fixed racial category. Families had no preserved identity through oral tradition, though through oral tradition, surnames, and community memory, since official records denied it. By the time we, as Gen X, came of age, we inherited both the Negro label from our parents and the Black reclamation movement that reshaped identity. We had the 1970s, and then that was good times right there, and they were a prime example of migrating from the South and the rural areas on the farms into the inner city hoods, and they that was a prime example of them. John, he couldn't never James could never get no damn job, and every time he tried, it was because of no high school diploma. I remember those things. I do. I truly do. And then that TV um in the background, and that curtain and that couch and the way them kids is dressed. I remember that in the 70s. So again, in the 70s, the sickle cell anemia testing, Black Community Survival Conference. So the older ones would be our parents. But I remember this in the 70s because that was the big afros. And then we're moving into the 80s. You got the Cosbys, 227, and just that whole 1980s vibe, with that outfit on Uncle Buster's Cookout. We remember these things. Then we get into the late 80s. It starts really changing. If you look at those clothes from back, okay? If you look at, I know, right, David? If you look at the clothes from, the 1970s, from when we was little to the 1980s, it's a humongous difference. Now, this would have been us, in high school as Gen X, and coming out of high school. It's interesting. You got the Salt and Pepper and Spinderella. That was us in high school. And then, can't lie, y'all, Gen X destroyed the hoods as parents in the hood madness, 1990s. Many of us tried, and it was tough. It was really tough. And then meanwhile, in the midst of all the gang violence and the shooting and the drug dealers in our community, they still, tried to keep us focused with giving us shows like The Parenthood and Living Single and things of that nature. They really tried, but it was tough. I mean, this transition from being little children in the 70s And then to the 80s and 90s, that's just like a humongous change in behavior, community behavior. And now we get the millennials coming in as we are their parents, a lot of us, Gen X. And they, as adults, you know, we had our babies was little, like little one, I forget her name, on the Cosby Show, the baby girl. But this was us. This was our lifestyle. This is how we dressed when we went to work. And, they tried to give us like families, to keep our faith, and, moving forward with education. And, we got a black judge, and the daughter who does nothing, and the smart son. They tried to keep us focused despite what was going on in our communities. They kept these shows on for us. So, millennials generation is from 1981 to 1996, post civil rights era, born after the legal and end of segregation, but still face systemic inequality in schools, housing, and policing. Identity language. By this era, black was the dominant term of pride and solidity. African American gained traction in the late 1980s and 1990s as a formal cultural identity. Jesse Jackson. Education and opportunity. More access to integrated schools and universities through disparities. Persistent technology shift. First generation to grow up with computers, internet, and cell phones. These are millennials. And yeah, they had those shows on, The Living Single. All that was out there. Millennials, generation, the kids from 81 to 96, coming of age, 1990s to the 2000 hip hop culture. Millennials were shaped by hip hop, R&B, and spoken word, cultural vehicles for identity, protest, and pride. Economic challenges. Entered adulthood during the 2008 financial crisis, facing student debt and limited job prospects. Social justice. Millennials became central to movements like Black Lives Matter, founded 2013, pushing against systemic racism and police violence. Global awareness, more connected to diasporic identity, linking Black American struggles to African and Caribbean heritage. Characteristics of Black millennials: tech savvy, digital natives using social media to organize and amplify voices. Activist driven, protest cultural, grassroots organizing, and online campaigns define their civic engagement. Cultural innovators dominated music, fashion, and digital storytelling. Resilient, navigated systemic inequality while building new platforms for visibility. Indigenous perspective. For families with erased tribal ancestry, by the millennial era, descendants were fully absorbed into the Black African American category. Tribal surnames and oral traditions remain the only markers of indigenous heritage. Millennials carried forward the double identity, officially Black African American, but privately tied to erased indigenous roots. Indigenous perspective. Millennial Blacks, 1981 to 96, grew up in a post-segregated America, embracing Black pride and African American identity while facing systemic inequality, economic challenges, and police violence. They became the digital activists and cultural innovators of their time, carrying forward erased indigenous identities into a new era of reclamation. Importantly, millennials are the largest advocates on social media for restoring our true identity as Aboriginals and American Indians, using digital platforms to challenge erasure, reclaim heritage, and amplify voices that history tried to silence. And that's a fact. We see it today. We're with them today, right here with them. Generation X and millennials, the bridge of memory. They were born 19 oh 1965 to 1980. Gen X grew up in the shadow of segregation, of the rise of Black identity politics. Many were raised by silent and baby boomer elders who still carried the Negro label and the trauma of erasure. As adults, Gen X became strong researchers, record keepers, and restorers to assist the millennials, digging through census rolls, land deeds, church locks, and oral testimonies. Together with their adult babies, the millennials are the ones who discuss those last minute truths, and second and third grandmothers and grandfathers, the ones who whispered, "We were Indian, but they called us colored." Restoration art. Today, Gen X and Gen Y, who are the millennials, as parents, are validating their millennial children's digital advocacy with hard evidence, names, places, burial records, and tribal surnames. They are clearing the record by showing that their families were never African descended, but rather indigenous people classified as colored or Negro. This generation is bridging the silence, translating memory into documentation and documentation into truth. Generation Z, born 1997 to 2012, is the first truly digital native generation born into smartphones, social media, and global connectivity. But for Black youth and descendants of reclassified indigenous families, Gen Z is also the generation of bold reclamation, viral truth telling, and unapologetic identity. Gen Z, I gotta read this again. But Black youth, this is Gen Z, y'all. Black youth and descendants of reclassified indigenous families, Generation Z, is also the generation of bold reclamation, viral truth telling, and unapologetic identity. For real. Coming of age 2010s to 2020s. Social media. This is still Gen Z. Gen Z led viral campaigns for justice, from Black Lives Matters to Indigenous and acknowledgement. Indigenous and acknowledgement. Digital reclamation. TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube became platforms for restoring erased identities, exposing historical lies, and amplifying ancestral truth. Language shift. Gen Z proudly uses terms like Aboriginal, American Indian, copper colored, and indigenous, rejecting African American when it doesn't reflect their lineage. Cultural power. Music, fashion, and art are infused with reclamation. Tribal prints, ancestral names, and historical corrections go viral. Characteristics of Black and reclassified Gen Z. They are unapologetic. They don't ask for permission to reclaim identity, they declare it. Historically curious, obsessed with old census records, surnames, and oral history clips from elders. This is Gen Z, y'all. Ancestrally rooted. Many are reconnecting with tribal lands, family names, and oral traditions, often guided by Gen X parents and millennial mentors. Gen Z is the generation of viral reclamation and unapologetic truth. For Black youth and descendants of reclassified indigenous families, Gen Z is using digital tools to correct the record, restore erased identities, and reclaim the names their grandparents whispered in secret. They are not just learning history, they are rewriting it in real time. And here they go. My goodness. It's just, this is how the times have changed. I mean, this is the unfortunate, and we go through this and we see, it coming along, the twerking era. It's like, this is Gen Z. Unfortunate. This is how we, really lost. Gen Z is unapologetic. They write a lot about Gen Z. Mainstream narrative, the first true digital native childhood shaped by smartphones, social media, and global connectivity. Known for openness about identity, mental health, and activism. Um, the right side. Gen Z proudly reject African American when it doesn't reflect lineage. They use hashtags, live streams, and viral posts to restore erased identities. Largest wave of youth declaring themselves Aboriginals, American Indians, and copper color. They carry forward ancestral surnames and oral traditions into digital spaces. Childhood youth, digital natives, born into Wi-Fi, smartphones, and social media. No memory of life before the internet. Global awareness. Grew up with access to global conversations, cultures, and movements. Education and identity. More likely to question official narratives, challenge textbooks, and seek truth beyond the classroom. This is Gen Z. Mental health and expression. Openly discuss trauma, identity, and healing, often through memes, music, and video storytelling. That's Gen Z. Year 2000 inner cities. And this is, in our hood. 2000, this is what you have. They're entertainers, you know. They're in a generation where they don't mind getting butt lifts and all this other stuff. It's just wild to me. In 2025, protecting trans people is not up for debate. This Gen Z, it is what it is, with the diversity, equity, inclusion, and this is in their era, literally. And that's it. So I can't believe I did 117 slides, you guys, because I truly did not want to come back here and do that. I wanted to get it done and for all. So now I automatically have my February 2026 newspaper. So I got the January one that's going to go up from the last one I did, and I have the February 2026 one that's going to go up. So this is really cool. So I hope that I, helped a lot of people out in understanding how to read the census sheet and when it all started and how it started. So you might have to watch it a couple of times to see this is happening in real life. This happened in real life time. That's why I went all the way back from Europe. Now I was over in Europe, and I had to go over in Europe to follow Europe to here to see how it was done. Literally how it was done. And this is the truth in it. And it has to be factual because it's written, it's posted, we live it. And the story really tells a huge story, especially when you're going back to year 990 and coming forward, and it lets you know who was here. It wasn't nobody here but white people and us. That's it. There was no other. That's the reason why I read it from all the way back. And I could have went back, a couple of hundred more years to make it to year one. But I traveled with them in this lecture from year 1990 all the way up until now. And not one time in a historical tracking did they mention any Asian people as being Indians. It was them and us here. That's it. The whole time in the whole history line of the researchers, and I got that information from actual scholars and researchers that wrote these things. And even in their teachings, they did not talk about Asian people being here with the census sheets and who they classified. They never stated that they classified any Asian people, anybody from India, or anything. The only people that they classified was us and them. And they kept limiting the term. They got it all the way down to, okay, you're either white or you're either colored or Negro. Colored, that was it. No other race. And I went back, and these are scholars. When they was writing, they did not mention any other race, just us, just Indians over here. So who are they talking about? We're the only ones with those racial classifications. There's nobody else. And we read about Latin America and Central America. They had their own system. It had nothing to do with United States. So this is what I'm telling you. It doesn't make any sense to get upset or angry about how you're finding it. This story speaks for itself. And nowhere in that history did they speak about anybody but us. How do we know it's us? We're the only ones with those classifications on our documents. Although our ancestors were silenced, the papers weren't silenced because history's telling you what they did when they classified us. It's telling you. Our ancestors were silenced, but today it's different. You know, we can now identify. It's okay. You're not going to be hung in a tree, and that's so painful to hear. Your grandmothers, our grandmothers today would be me if, like, I have grandsons. I don't have to whisper to them, you ain't African, you Indian. We don't got to whisper like our grandparents did. We can talk about it now. And it's truly okay. But I've been on for 2.5 hours. Like I said, I'm going to be getting my segments down to 1 hour. I'm going to get it down packed like Candace. But these two segments that I did will be in the January and February newspaper, the whole slide. So I got some really great newspapers coming up. And I'm with that being said, I don't know. I try to give people a chance to come on the panel, but today I'm not. I'm really tired. And, you know, I hope everybody enjoyed the segment. I'm going to get out of here. I love you guys and have a wonderful, wonderful evening.